We're fortunate here today to have James Casey join us. Utilizing over 20 years of sponsored research experience, James has two roles at Florida Gulf Coast University: Interim Associate Vice President, Research and Sponsored Programs, and Interim Director of Emerging Technologies Institute. He is a founding adjunct associate professor in the City University of New York, master's degree in research administration and compliance program. He has worked virtually in all areas of research administration, but finds passion in the areas of contracting, data protection, international collaboration, and sponsored research, office enhancement, re-engineering. He is also passionate about the intersection of law, research administration, and science. Over the past few years, he's expanded his expertise portfolio to include data protection and privacy, and is a CPP for EU GDPR DPO role. So that's data protection, and is a longtime contributor to Incura and received the Incura Distinguished Service Award in 2009. Please welcome James. Thank you. James, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you, Jeffrey, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today for the 8th annual FRAC conference. This is always an excellent opportunity to share knowledge and best practice and leading practices. This session is on the overview of contracting for the research administrator. And I guess the way I've always looked at this is that successful contracting is both a technical skill, but it's also an interpersonal communication skill. And so what I will be talking about today is really a mix of the two. Certainly, as you'll see in some slides as we go forward here, part of my success in my career has been always finding reasons to get the contract done, finding reasons to say yes rather than no. So let's carry on with the next slide. Okay, today's agenda. As I was just saying, this is an excellent opportunity to cover both the technical aspects of contracting as well as the interpersonal and communication aspects. So what I'm going to cover today are some of the special contract issues that you need to be aware of and always keep in the back of your mind. A second point on this presentation is adding value to your institution. Sometimes contracting offices have a bad reputation on campus because they're perceived to always find reasons to say no. That in fact, they don't add value to the institution. They take too long to negotiate. There's always issues with intellectual property and other specific clauses, and it takes too long, and we can't build collaborations. Well, I come from a different school of thought, and I like to think of what the contracting office does as adding value to your institution. Everything you do, through the contracts, to the communication, to the working with senior leadership, is to add value to your institution. So that's part of the presentation today. I will be talking about leading practices in contracting, experiences I've had over my professional career. And if I had to think and go back to how many contracts I did not sign in my career, I think you're basically talking two hands. It's a very rare occurrence. In my professional career, I practiced law before I went into research administration. And I don't know if that helped me a lot, but certainly it made negotiations easier if the party on the other side is in the general counsel office. As I said earlier, I like to find reasons to say yes. And hopefully you have that same perspective, or if you are neutral on the subject, that when you leave here, you think, we should find reasons to say yes, and that will build better relationships with the faculty. And at the end, we will have a wrap up and a Q&A, and I will leave at least 10 minutes of time. Last year, this session triggered a whole bunch of questions, many of which could not be handled during this session. But after the session is done, on one of the slides here, and you will get a deck shortly afterwards, you'll see my email address at FGCU, as well as my CUNY and a private business email address. So please feel free to reach out to me with any questions if we don't get to them today. Okay, next. So this slide is really, I think, some of the operational standpoint issues that many contract negotiators have experienced in their career. If you're new to contracting, some of this is going to be fresh, and maybe some of you on this session today only have a passing or tangential interaction with contracts, in which case this overview is excellent for you to keep these things in mind, because once again, you are in research administration to add value. There's no other way to put it. And if there's one phrase that you should emphasize back at your home institution, it's to add value. Obviously, one of the major sticking points in contracts often is liability and indemnification in case something should go wrong. Now, I've always come from the school that we should have mutual clauses in this area, meaning each party indemnifies and holds harmless the other for their own acts and omissions. Some institutions don't want to negotiate that way, and they will accept one-way liability, meaning if a company is giving a university research, it won't be mutual indemnification if something goes wrong. So my suggestion on that point is to avoid one-way clauses in this area, in fact, in many of these areas, and go for a mutual clause. And in my experience, it's never been that big of a sticking point. Now, the one thing you should be aware of is if you're at a public university, the public universities have or are limited by specific clauses that are often drafted by general counsel for the system or recommended from those lawyers for use at your university. So that is a little bit more of a limiting factor, but there should be a way around that. I've worked at two public university systems, and we've always found a way. So I generally am not concerned about that. Certainly at the private universities, you have more leeway, and that actually allows for a little bit more creativity in the language itself. Because one of the things that I've always loved about contracting is the ability to be a little creative. As I will say in a later slide, but it's important to bear now, that contracts are more than just templates. Faculty assume that every contract is just a template. You can fill in a bunch of boxes and both parties can sign and they can go ahead and do the work. Well, that's not always the case, although if you have FTP subawards and that sort of template, which is universally recognized in many ways as being a great template, at least in the West, that's a different story. But many contracts are not simply amendable to templates. So keep that in mind. If everything was all about templates, the profession would be not what it is today. Another important issue to consider is acts of God or force majeure clauses. These, for many years, were simply just something that they were there, you never negotiated it out. Most private companies and universities and governments basically just use similar language. It was never negotiated out, never tweaked the language, that sort of thing. But with COVID and what has happened in the last 2+ years now, force majeure is being litigated in courts in the United States. So it's not quite the topic you could basically ignore. It is something you need to pay a little more close attention to. And on the topic of COVID, of course, it impacts the next bullet point, which is project deliverables and timelines due to supply chain issues and illness of staff and faculty at collaborating institutions. And that is one point where I think contracting officers can really serve a great purpose, which is that our role, yes, it's to get the contract signed and the awards set up so the work can happen, but really it's our job to help pay attention in terms of the management of these contracts along the life cycle of that contract. So it's good to check in. And you may have problems with supply chain issues 4 months into a project. So that is an example where contract officers, contract negotiators, however you're titled, you can provide added value by occasionally checking in. And I've always appreciated faculty that would come to me for 5 months after the contract was signed, and they'll just check in with me. And I think that's fantastic because it's open communication, and they're not going to be hiding anything that will require you or general counsel to clean up. Another issue, intellectual property. You know, what's there to say? Background and foreground IP are an issue, and you know, that topic alone is the subject of of sessions like this. But you know, when I guess as an operational point, as I start thinking about a contract and talking to a faculty member about their project, I always ask the first question: are you bringing any intellectual property into the project? Second, one of my probably next 5 questions is, do you expect your project to lead to any IP? Now that may lead to another issue down the road as you're negotiating a contract, which is how much fight should you put into the IP terms if the odds of foreground IP created during the project is remote or non-existent. You know, you can't ascribe a percentage to it, but I in my professional career would have said, well, if there's a 1% chance that IP will be created from this project, we can probably stay silent on the topic, or we can put in a clause that says if it is created, both parties will negotiate in good faith. But I would not want it, in that case, I would not want to drag out negotiations for months on that 1%. And that is where sometimes faculty get this idea that contract or grant officers are more of a hindrance than a facilitator. Other contract issues, export controls, compliance. Once again, those are areas that are a subject of a session by themselves. All I would say at this point for this overview is that if you're at a university with an export control or a general compliance office, it's always to work in partnership with those individuals. And in the contract offices I've set up or I've managed or been part of, I've always had an open communication relationship with the compliance professionals. And that's just the way I do business. And I think that's the way many research administrators do. But, you know, in that area, collaboration is incredibly important. You'll also see dispute resolution. You know, there is clauses in many contracts, not all of them, that deal with what happens if the project goes south and what happens if the parties don't work well together and other problems of that nature. And what you see on this slide is different types of ways to resolve differences. Obviously, mediation or some informal resolution, infinitely preferable to arbitration through the AAA or litigation itself. But once again, I think if you communicate early and often with your counterparts that you are collaborating with, the odds of, even if a problem comes up, it would be easier to solve because both parties have been talking to each other on a consistent basis. And last point here, and depending on your level of expertise in research administration, faculty do not guarantee results. At least I hope they don't. I certainly do not ever recommend to faculty that they guarantee results with their sponsored research or their sponsored project activities. We would say in the contract that the faculty will use their best efforts. But if you think about it, if you're in science or in the social sciences or in health and human services, a lot of different areas, you're dealing with a number of variables that are hard to predict. So how can you guarantee anything? That's my perspective. All right, so don't guarantee results, but say you'll do your best effort in getting the work done at the price that's in the proposal. Okay, next slide. One issue I did want to talk about today, and this is something a little more near and dear to my heart over the last few years, but which is also coming up a lot more in contracts, is the whole area of data protection and privacy. Now, within the United States, both HIPAA and FERPA have been around a while, several decades at least. And so people that work in healthcare or with a lot of student data are fully aware of HIPAA and FERPA. If you're in clinical trials, I'm sure you know of HIPAA. So for some of you on this call today, you're probably an expert, more than I am, in HIPAA and FERPA themselves. But the point I'm making today is that the whole idea of data protection or people's privacy of their own data has grown exponentially beyond HIPAA and FERPA. Now, in Europe, with the GDPR taking effect in May 2018, they say that data protection and privacy is a basic human right. Well, we don't really have that at that broad a scope in the United States, at least not yet, and I hope someday we get to that point. So that's a difference in what is going on in the whole data protection privacy realm, is that there is all this talk, and we see it every day in the news of data breaches. 10 million credit card numbers stolen, social security numbers stolen. I have personally had a couple of my PII, personally identifiable information, stolen. This is something that concerns all of us, whether personally or professionally. But this is all starting to show up in contracts that are university, that involve university collaboration. Certainly with money coming from European universities to American universities, you're getting GDPR clauses in there. And since this has been effective for over 3 years, coming on 4, a lot of the major research universities have seen these already, but it will continue to grow. The wild card in all this is that the United States does not have an overarching omnibus privacy or data protection statute, and there are various possibilities coming out of Washington. But what has happened in the meantime, and Thursday I am talking about this topic in greater depth, is that the states have been filling in the federal vacuum. California, most prominent of all of them, with the CCPA. But this is something that is should be all on our radar. And as the third bullet point here talks about, while I talk about data protection and privacy as being kind of like one and the same, they're not really. And the Thursday session will talk a little bit more about that. And similarly, the whole area of cybersecurity, which is kind of like a first cousin to data protection and privacy. Cybersecurity, which all of us probably are aware of in a vague way, is part of this universe also. And you know, for at least a decade, if not longer, cybersecurity clauses have been showing up in contracts. And that is another area you need to be concerned with. As a best practice, I like to say that based upon your project and what your faculty member is proposing to do, depending on the project, you may want to include a clause in there dealing with data protection or privacy. Obviously, in the medical realm, with clinical trials, a lot of that will already have the standard language. But in other areas, you should start thinking about it that way. The rest of this slide, I would say GDPR is the gold standard right now. Many countries have passed data protection or privacy statutes based upon the GDPR. The United States is not a leader in this area at the present time. We are playing catch up. And that, I hope, is rectified in the next 1 to 2 years. But in the bottom slide, bottom bullet point, you'll see some of the new hot topics that are out of the technology realm, which are algorithms, algorithmic regulation, algorithmic decision-making. And algorithms are designed by software engineers in computer networks baked into architecture. And so many decisions, including the whole internet now, as we now know it. And if you buy on Amazon, there's algorithms everywhere. And there's a whole topic called nudging, if you haven't heard of it yet. Nudging is basically where, algorithms and what the software engineers are doing is they're kind of driving people to make certain decisions without telling them no. So the computers basically are getting to the point where if you go shopping and you buy something on Amazon, you'll see, oh, here are some other recommended products you may like. Well, that comes out of an algorithm, okay? And so it does lead to some fascinating discussions in the political and social policy realm. But I would say for this class, for this session here today, the whole topic of algorithms, machine learning, which is an advanced form of algorithmic activity, as well as the more general concept of artificial intelligence, are something you should educate yourself in, at least in standpoint of having it in the back of your head. Certainly if you have a lot of faculty in the sciences and engineering, in computer science, I have schooled myself in these areas over the last few months. And because I don't have that background by my original education, but it has made so many things clear if you know what these things do and how they impact all of us, either within universities or in the private retail industry, for instance. So hopefully, if you want to learn more about data protection, privacy, cybersecurity, and these topics on this slide, come to the Thursday session, Thursday afternoon session. Okay, next. Okay, now this slide goes back to my early comments on adding value at your institution. I'd like to say the question this way: what do you stand for? Okay, there's another question. Do you do just what is necessary, or do you go the extra mile? And truth be told, and honestly, I've crossed paths with people on the entire spectrum between those two areas. But what I have learned is that to have the most enjoyable career, the less stress, the best working relationships with faculty, is to think about how you can add value to everything you do for them, okay? And so much of research administration is building partnerships and relationships. And I understand that at many universities, due to volume of work, number of contracts, for instance, it's hard to get out to have coffee with the faculty. But I learned that many years ago at Northwestern University that getting your business officers out for a coffee or lunch, or get your leading faculty out for lunch, getting new faculty out for a coffee, out of the lab, out of the office, into the real world. That sort of building relationships goes a great way to help you doing your job better, in this case with contracts. And that sort of mindset is equally applicable in the international realm, where you will often, where in many cultures, that relationship is even more important than what Americans would put on the relationship. I have never been one to advocate communicating only by email or by phone. You know, now the pandemic has forced the use of video, like today, and video is great. It serves its purpose. But you know what? I'd always rather see someone in person. And, you know, from a management standpoint, with contracting, when I supervise contracting officers, I'd always say, get out to the labs, get out to see your faculty, at least talk substantively with a couple faculty every month, at least 2. And that's the minimum. And yes, it takes a little time, you know, and hopefully you don't have to drive 30 miles to meet the faculty, but if you're on the same campus, it takes a little bit of a walk. But once again, I mean, there's so much benefit in making that extra value. And I see it at my current institution. The faculty really appreciate that, getting out and seeing them in their environments. So if you're doing that, great. If you're not, talk to your boss. If you are the boss, try and find a way to, you know, inspire and get your staff to go out and talk to the faculty. So that's the human part of how we can add value in our research administration jobs. And the last point on that topic, I would simply say, I was never one, even early in my career, that I wanted to sit in the office all day and do contracts. I did want to get out. I wanted to see faculty. I went to the offices. I went to brown bag lunches. Anything I could do, because I figured if you made some effort up front, it would pay on the back end. And oftentimes that was the case, regardless of whether I was reviewing proposals or negotiating contracts. The second part, bullet point here is, you know, when you're talking to the PI or the staff on a sponsored project, talk to them about how you can best help them by being involved early. Oftentimes, unfortunately, and this is silo mentality, or it could be just the culture that you were hired into, oftentimes the faculty don't reach out to you until something has gone really bad. And so I've always said that more proactive work on the front end means less hassle on the back end, and hopefully even less interaction with general counsel, because, and nothing against general counsel, because I'm a lawyer myself, but I really wanted them not to have to involve in sponsored research unless it was absolutely necessary. So that's becoming a problem solver in your own realm of how you get things solved without having to bring the lawyers at the university into the project. And I think if you're proactive and you know the rules, and of course you have to talk to the lawyers anyway as a general matter about what is allowable, what is permissible, what are the alternate contract language clauses you can use for specific areas. But beyond that, you know, I think there's a lot of ways to troubleshoot in a friendly way, and they never have to get involved. You know, I think when I worked at Northwestern years ago, there were only a couple times in 4.5 years I had to go to them. And that made me feel great. And it wasn't because I was a lawyer. It's just that you try and figure out ways in that culture at that time of getting problems solved without it becoming a major issue. Third bullet point, early and continual communication with your contracting counterpart is critical. Obviously, if you negotiate contracts, you know what I'm talking about. If you're new to this area, well, this is something important, but also commonsensical, because this general concept also applies on the proposal development end anyway, where being proactive at the beginning is always better than finding out, 2 days before deadline that Professor X is writing a grant and it's due. And yes, that happens every day, and we all have it. But once again, continual communication is critical. Last bullet point is what I was alluding to earlier, which is that, we are using more communication tools than we ever needed to before. Okay, before the pandemic, it was phone calls, email, in person, and travel. Actually, I mean, I had one contract with the Spanish company where the leadership of the company in Spain flew to the United States to sit in my office for 15 minutes to sign a contract. That was it. Then they wanted to have lunch for 2 hours, and then they got back on the plane to go back to Spain. Now that obviously is an anomaly, but for them in that culture at that time, that's the way they did business. Now, that is a rarity. I'll grant you that. But once again, the important point is always try and keep it the most personal that you can. I love video. It serves an important purpose, but I get zoomed out. I get teamed out, and the pandemic is going longer than we all anticipated. And it very well could be an on and off scenario for a good part of this year. But in doing your work, whether it's at home or whether you're in the office, try and figure out the best way to make it as warm and personable and welcoming as possible. Because I think, once again, going the extra step will help with a working relationship with your potential collaborators. Okay, next. Leading practices. I go back to the phrase I learned early in my career. And it doesn't matter what part of research administration you're in, whether it's compliance or pre-award or it's post-award or contracting, you always want to find reasons to say yes, not no, because many faculty at many institutions think that administrative types like us live to say the word no, and that we get great pleasure out of telling faculty no. And while I've worked with a couple folks in my career that have been that way, that's certainly the exception. And I find no upside to having such a disposition in getting your work done. I've always found the success to be greater in finding ways to thread the needle to get a project off the ground. Now, when I say find reasons to say yes, I have to add this disclaimer. Don't take any of this to mean that you should do something unethical, illegal, because I'm not advocating any of that, never have. But and sometimes the rules are the rules, and not everything is negotiable. But once again, some things are, and how you say it to faculty is just as important as what the substance is. And that, I think, is critically important, because that goes to disposition in your office. If your office has a reputation for being very helpful, but occasionally you have to put your foot down and say, we can't do that, we can't allow this. Well, some people may grumble, but they'll understand, because 90% of the time you're saying yes. Or you're saying, well, we can't do it this way, but if we move these pieces around, we can do it, and you still get to the end that you want. So sometimes it's just moving the pieces around to find the optimal situation. The second bullet point on this slide, very important concept, quality contracts lead to better PI and staff project management. okay? Contracts that are sloppily written, work scopes that are not airtight, that aren't clear to the average reader. That can lead to problems with management, which once again can bring you back into the picture down the road, or bring general counsel in down the road. So when I say quality contracts, I mean contracts that are built for project success, while having all the normal clauses we'd want in them, of course. But you know, there's two aspects to contracting, and if you're in a contracts office, you know about metrics, and that's a whole course in itself. But you know, one of the major metrics is how long does it take to negotiate contracts in that office, from intake to execution. Okay, that obviously there's no right answer. Some contracts are easy to do very quickly. Some may take 4 to 6 months, depending on IP or other terms and conditions. But by and large, you do want a fairly quick turnaround on a good portion of your contracts, but you also want these quality contracts that I'm talking about. So speed and quality is really part of our stock and trade if you work in contracting. Third bullet point, I've kind of already have talked about it, which is that let's say your business card, your website says you're a contract negotiator. Well, that's fine. But, you know, once again, you want to be someone that adds value to the faculty project, to the contract, to your institution. Okay. So which means you look beyond just your narrow job as a contract negotiator. One of the best tips I give my CUNY students is that, you know, from the beginning when I was, well, a young research administrator, I guess you could say, I always wanted to learn about the field beyond what my job description required. I was pre-award, okay, but I wanted to learn more about compliance, or I was pre-award and I read the OMB circulars as they existed at that time. So that was the way I figured that, you know, as to be the best research administrator you want to be, you learn not only what your current job is, but you learn for the future. And that, you know, that's why the saying is, you know, you can have a successful career, but planning ahead creates the luck that helps you to move forward. So keep that in mind, you know, adding value, professional development always. You'll be ready when luck opens that door and you can step through it. Fourth bullet point, as a contracting professional, your job often does not end with the execution of a legal instrument. You troubleshoot. Once again, that goes back to you've signed it, it's been established into an award, the project's underway. There could often be bumps in the road going into the future, and you will be called to interpret a clause or provide advice on the best way to handle this sort of a problem. So once again, that's value. That's not just saying, well, I negotiated the contract, my job is done, and you wash your hands of it, and you send you know, the faculty member maybe to post-award, non-financial, obviously, and hopefully find somebody else that will solve the problem. So as a contracting professional, I've always been at the ready to help, even if I've done negotiating the contract. The second to last bullet point is a very important distinction, okay? The sponsored research / legal side is one issue. The other issue is business decisions, which means sometimes the lawyers or a contracting professional like myself could tell, you know, a dean or a provost or a vice president or a university president, well, this contract is good. We can live with the terms and conditions, but there's risks, especially with international contracts. And at that point, it will become a business decision for that leader. a provost, a vice president for research, a university president, to say, okay, thank you for providing all your input. I still want to support the faculty, sign the contract, and we'll hope for the best. And of course, keep our eyes open too. So this is the difference where you negotiate your best contract that does not have clauses that violate university policy or state or federal law or what have you. But there are some that need that business decision to be brought into play. And one final point on that, Office of General Counsel, sponsored project offices, we are service offices to the university. We provide a service, we provide our best expertise, and that is a good commonality between sponsored research and offices of general counsel. And the last point on this slide is at the institutional level, make sure you build a contracting pipeline. Meaning if your university wants to move forward, wants to build sponsored research, wants to bring more money in, you build a contracting pipeline that goes from teaming agreements, non-disclosure agreements, material transfer agreements, to actually sponsored research agreements. That will lead to IP, it could lead to licensing and technology transfer, commercialization into the private sector. That brief description I'm giving you today, although I do have an excellent slide on it, really shows a linear way that you can build a contracting pipeline so you support the faculty. And if you show the faculty this, they will know that they and you, as well as the whole institution, is going in the right direction. Okay, next. Final thoughts before we move on to Q&A. Once again, I can't say it enough. Find reasons to say yes. Don't say no unless it's absolutely necessary. Sometimes you need to be a little creative with the contract language to make it work. But contracting is part art and part science. Okay. The science part is the actual language and the clauses and maybe what is permissible in your state university system and that sort of thing. But the art is being able to massage the English language and work with finding a result both parties can live with. And I really haven't talked about international contracting, but interpreting contracts or having contracts in two languages simultaneously, that results in different issues, which are really a subject of another session. Third bullet point here. As much as I like being a lawyer, don't sound like a lawyer, please. There's enough of us. So don't sound like a lawyer, don't sound like a bureaucrat, okay? And what I mean by that, I've seen it many times in my career, and if I catch myself doing it, I have to stop myself. But sometimes you make it sound like it's all a robotic exercise, and that this is just one of a number of things. Or you make the faculty member, whether it's intentional or not, feel a little bit stupid or a little bit small. And I think the pandemic, if it has taught many of us, and I hope it has, we should be adding some humanity to our research administration work. It's negotiating contracts, it's post-award, certainly compliance, where compliance has a lot of rules that you simply can't change. Now, with the federal government, that's the price of playing in that sandbox, okay? But, outside those areas, it really comes down to how you sound and how you talk to others. At one university I worked at, we brought in a communication coach on how staff, it'd be working on examples together and how you can respond to faculty in a certain way, how you talk like this. In this sort of situation, this kind of method will work much better. It's an old adage in higher education, and maybe you've heard it, but the adage goes, in higher education, the smaller the issue, the pettier people get. The smaller the issue, the pettier people get. Keep that in mind. That can largely, you can counteract that by being a little more nuanced in your communication and approach. Another bullet point here on the international areas, there's a whole set of different suggestions in the international realm. Obviously, cultural differences matter, cultural sensitivities matter, and this requires understanding. And when I have done work overseas with colleagues, sometimes I've had to do a little studying on that particular region of what their sensitivities are, what matters to them, what their approaches are like. A little work on the side actually made the result easier. So keep that in mind. And my last point here is contracting is much more than templates, and they have their role, don't get me wrong, but it can't all be reduced to having your sponsored research template, your MTA template, your subaward template, and that's the entire universe. The universe is much more complicated than that. Okay, next slide. Okay, here are my email addresses. Please reach out to me. We're getting ready to go into a Q&A session. But at any rate, it was a pleasure talking to you so far. If I do not get through all questions today, we have about 13 minutes. Feel free to email me at any of these email addresses and I will get back to you.
Thank you so much, James. That was an excellent presentation. We have a question in the chat. What about during an audit? Defending a yes isn't always that easy.
Defending a yes?
Yes.
Well, you know, if you're being audited, you have to create a paper trail. And if you're creating a paper trail and you have decided that yes is the appropriate route, you should have a document that memorializes that. In the legal world, you call that a CYA document. And decorum prohibits me from giving the full name, but it's really, and that is not a bad habit to have, because you do have to keep notes to sponsor research files. And I have done that in my career, especially with contentious negotiations. I had one case about a dozen years ago that involved a major Chinese technology company called Huawei, and that required a lot of notes to the file. But I think if you're open with the auditors, if you have documented why you are taking the route you are, I think that makes it more defensible.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the chat. With being in different states with different laws, have you ever seen where a party wanted to remain silent on arbitrary jurisdiction? Is this common?
I've seen it. I've seen it. I've seen there's always a risk with being silent. Sometimes instead of just completely staying silent, I would say if an issue comes up, let's say with jurisdiction, that the parties will negotiate in good faith on it. Otherwise, if you stay silent on too much, you run the risk of throwing it into the court system and having the courts start to decide what law should apply or what jurisdiction should apply. I would say in my career, it was pretty rare that I stayed silent on more than a couple items and got the best language I could on the rest.
Great. We have another question. Can you explain GDPR a little bit more, exactly what it is? What is it intended to cover?
Well, the General Data Protection Regulation went into effect, I believe, May 2018. I think it's May 25th, 2018. It is the overarching privacy data protection statute in the European Economic Area, although people generally say it's the EU. And that really, it superseded a 1995 data protection regulation, which was good in some ways, but technology had advanced so much that people felt, and I believe it too, people felt that their privacy was not being protected by big companies, that the sale and resale of personal information, whether we put it out there intentionally or not, is making a lot of profit. And ironically, there are some streams of thought in Europe that say that, if a company wants your personal data, they should pay you for it because they're making a profit on it anyway. And some folks in Europe have called for a dividend check to Americans. Let's say, I'm not going to say Americans, but a dividend check to people whose data they have used. Because if they're making profit off your data and you're not seeing any of it, then that's a sweet deal for them. The only advantage that we have seen, I guess, let's say in the retail consumer sector, is that we have ease of access on the internet. We get a lot of choices in Amazon Prime and, on major corporate websites, and maybe the price is discounted, maybe it's not. That's like what we're getting for them using all of our data. And obviously Facebook has been involved, in a number of issues in this area, which also go into the political decision-making realm of the Cambridge Analytica case from a few years ago. And with the 2016 election and then President Trump. So, the Europeans have started from the standpoint that data protection, privacy of personal information is a basic human right. We don't even have that in the United States yet. Can you imagine that? But, the concept of us having choice in the United States is a bedrock within all of our major documents, including the Constitution. Democracies are built on everybody having choice to do what they want. But guess what? Algorithms have changed that matrix now, because whether we realize it or not, algorithms are starting to direct us down different paths. And as it turns out, I'm writing an article for the Wisconsin Lawyer magazine in their March issue, talking about how data protection privacy statutes like the GDPR are being weakened by the explosion in big data, in artificial intelligence, machine learning, all this stuff I talked about with algorithms before. And it involves all of us as people, not just research administration as a particular profession. So I hope that's a good start. I'd encourage you to stop by on Thursday afternoon. I think my other sessions from 4 to 5. I also have a couple good slides there that show the history of privacy in the United States, the major statutes like FERPA and HIPAA. We also call it FIPS, which is Fundamental Privacy Principles, that came out in 1973, I believe. And we have the progression in Europe. And obviously some companies are very much objecting to the GDPR version of protecting people's data. And I know the business community will fight any attempt to make the US, a large US statute, to be as rigorous as what the Europeans have. But, if you've been around long enough, and I guess I have, and I have worked in the real world before the internet, I remember what it was. And so for people of a certain age, we have that presence of the past to realize how the internet has changed everything, which is vastly different from people who, were born in 1990 and, they're 20 and 20, well, they're born in 2000 and they don't know any other world. And so when people you know, and as I'll point out in this one article, think about the pandemic. People are forming their opinions about vaccines and masks based upon what they're reading on the internet. Well, the internet is built upon algorithmic activity. And so if you are predisposed in a certain position, you generally will look for information from those sources that support your predisposition. Well, that's all backed up by algorithms too. And so algorithms and all of that is impacting social policy and political communication as we speak. I think most of that is for research administration. That's more of a broad picture for all of us to understand that's going on, but a lot more faculty, and I know here at FGCU, heightened interest in algorithms and machine learning and building academic programs that speak to these pressing issues in the United States and beyond.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Do you distinguish between hold harmless and indemnification?
Well, I think most people would consider them to be a hand in glove, meaning that if you look at your standard clauses, they generally fit together like this. I don't have a legal dictionary in front of me to give you the specific legal breakdowns of it. But you know, it really does have to do with the assumption of liability and different degrees of culpability, meaning whether it's negligent, whether it's intentional, and we're talking about research administration with breakdown of project deliverables and that sort of thing. So I hope that's good enough for the point here today, but I wish I could pull a dictionary out and give you what Merriam-Webster says.
Well, thank you. And maybe we can squeeze in one more question.
Okay.
How do you address problematic terms in a third-party payment processing software that a sponsor uses when the problematic terms are not with the sponsor themselves?
Oh, you mean the flow down terms and conditions, right?
Well, I think the question here is focusing on problematic terms in a third-party payment processing software. So maybe a sponsor uses a payment processing software, and that payment processing software has problematic terms, but those problematic terms are not with the sponsor themselves.
Interesting point. You got me stumped. I mean, in all seriousness, you know, I think one of my business practices has always been trying to get to the root of what the issue is, which meant calling not only the sponsor, but having an in-depth discussion with the third-party vendor of why it is this way and whether there's any way to change things. You know, I mean, third-party payment systems are built on algorithms too. And that's why that whole issue is so intractable. In the area of data protection, there's something called the black box, which means trying to understand why a third-party payment system works, or why a sponsor uses a certain system, or why it can't be changed, you know, for better interface with us at the university. Sometimes the question is so complicated, no one can really answer it to you. And that's what they call the black box paradox of algorithmic activity. Some things are simply so complex that only the computer software professionals understand it.
Well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. It's been a pleasure.